New Horizons Radio.
Bien, señores, estamos acá de regreso en New Horizons Radio y en el día de hoy yo tengo la enorme y grata compañía de mi hija mayor, Shannon Garrido, con la cual vamos a conversar para el deleite de todos ustedes un poquito sobre algunos temas que nosotros hemos estado conversando y que yo entiendo que deben de ser discutidos de una manera más plena en nuestra sociedad y que obviamente la juventud dominicana pueda abordar estos temas que al final son de literatura, de educación, de conceptualización de cómo nosotros vemos e interpretamos lo que en el pasado quizá vimos como héroes y heroínas y como quizás grandes piezas literarias. Hoy en día la juventud dominicana, o no la juventud dominicana, la juventud en general, pues tiene unos ojos más críticos y lo visualiza de otra forma. For all our followers, this interview is going to be held in English, so I hope that you all enjoy it. Shannon, welcome again to New Horizons Radio.
Thank you.
We were discussing a little bit about how do we interpret great authors and how do we, look at literary work that might have been amazing, but that according even to yourself should not be written again.
It's not just that it should not be written again, it's that whenever you are in a position in which you have to analyze literature critically, you have to talk about the author's point of view, you have to talk about, a historical timestamp, and all of that is condensed into how, in a way, bigotry, is fleshed out in said book or said piece of work.
Bigotry, that's a big word.
Well, yes.
Why bigotry?
Well, because I think I use that word because it can encompass a lot of what I'm saying, but it can be, any aspect of ignorance or just like a, specific tone of bias, because obviously every author has bias. And we were talking about this because...
Should we cancel bias from literature?
Once again, you cannot cancel literature. That is not how that works. You can only analyze literature critically and understand whether that specific piece of work adds anything to any specific conversation, has any literary value today, and why we are talking about it the way that we are. And I think that the reason that a lot of older people have a hard...
Older people.
Yes.
No, we are the older people.
No, well, anybody else has a hard time, grasping their favorite authors being, called out for, racism or sexism or homophobia or whatever it would be, is because they're talking about their favorite authors and not, and sometimes we don't see people talk about their own. And so the reason that I was discussing specifically, a genre that, and a line of books that I specifically love a lot, and I know a lot of people also enjoyed a lot in their childhood, such as Harry Potter, is because it's something I love, but I can criticize in depth now because I should be able to. Just because I love something doesn't mean that I should exempt it from all of the things that should not be rewritten today. For example, J.K. Rowling herself, as a person, we know, is not the most, I would say, politically correct, but she simply is not always a very nice person. Does
she need to be a nice person?
Not a nice person, but definitely a self-aware human being. She doesn't need to be anything. It just, her, opinions on the trans community, or her opinions on African Americans, or her opinions on fascism and revolutions, and her style of writing, it shows that it comes from her. You can definitely see why she writes the way that she writes, and it is because she is not a very nice human being.
She's not a very nice human being.
No.
Why is she not a nice human being?
Well, that is a conversation for another time. That is a very extensive conversation. She just isn't, in my opinion, a very nice human being.
What makes her not nice as a human being?
Well, being a transphobe does not, guarantee you very nice spot in my book, first of all.
Okay.
Second of all, her remarks on.
Is does she demonstrate her phobia for
Yes, very outwardly.
within the context of her literature?
She demonstrates ignorance through almost every context of her literature. Yes.
Ignorance.
Yes. Just in terms of like the LGBTQ plus community, I would say that she does what a lot of writers do. And it's queer baiting. And so she realizes that two of the characters, specifically Remus and Nymphadora Tonks,
Nymphadora Tonks.
yes, these are two characters in the books who were deemed, very important to the gay community. And anybody who's a fan kind of knows that. And she made it a point, like many other writers do, to either not ever give, because there is no LGBTQ plus representation in these books, realistically, at least not in her knowledge, but she decided that these two very loved, queer icons, you could say, she made it a point to prove that they were not. And she actually married both of them randomly in the last, 2 or 3 books or something like that. Which is not something that not only she did unknowingly, because she did do this knowingly. She has said it several times that she knew what people thought about these characters, and she did not want people to continue to have these opinions. And she is in every right to not have, that specific representation. If that was never the plan she had for these characters, once again, she is in that right. But it just adds on to the very long list of ways that J.K. Rowling makes it a point to prove that she does not care about actually serving any kind of community who, at the end of the day has made her the successful author that she is today. When it comes to diversity, specifically racial diversity in her books, she makes it very clear that she kind of only adds characters of color, Asian characters, etc., if she, needs to prove that she has them. She never gives them a developed storyline. None of them are ever main characters. And, it's even funny because she gives all of the characters really interesting names. That's kind of what she's known for. That's something you make fun of all the time. The fact that, all of the names in Harry Potter are so, outwardly and stuff. But her characters of color are not. She makes it known that she does not want them to be a part of Harry Potter as the storyline. She wants them to be, the token characters of color, the token Asian, and it's very clear. It's not something that she tries to hide.
So you think she added those characters just to comply with social pressures?
It's not even social pressures per se. It's
or
almost
to attract a specific market?
Yes, it is to attract a specific market, which is way, way worse. In my opinion.
So after the first Harry Potter, because I don't think the first one, when she wrote it in a restaurant or whatever, or she started writing about it or sketching it or whatever the story, you think she became market conscious and then started to write the entire story with that in mind?
She was always market conscious. Just because she, has a very humbling story. Oh, she wrote it in a, restaurant and a bunch of pieces of paper, and she was denied from all of these publishing companies, doesn't mean she didn't have that in mind. Because specifically, the publishing company that ended up accepting her was a kids, it was for kids books, and all she was told was that kids books don't sell. And so what she marketed it as a kids book, but she wrote it for everybody else, and it's because of that exact reason, because children's books don't sell, which is why this book became so popular and so known everywhere, and everybody read it regardless of how old you were, because she did not actually write it for children. She marketed it as a kid's book, but once you read it and once everybody else read it, they realized that it wasn't just for kids, and that it was never gonna be just for kids because it was quite dark.
But don't you think that this level of criticism that you're imposing on an author like J.K. Rowling is unfair? Because, do you think Charles Dickens had to answer for Uncle Tom?
Well, Charles Dickens was...
Or that he would have had to face, a reporter from the New York Times telling him, "Oh, you're
No,
being a bigot and a racist"?
No, he didn't, and that might have been the issue. The problem is that today any sort of criticism is seen as unfair, but these are the people that are putting their work out there for criticism. That's the whole point.
There's a difference between literary criticism,
correct,
and value criticism, or because you're not criticizing the literary value of her
yes,
work.
you are, because
You
when
are?
you, of course.
Tell me about the literary value of her
Because
work.
in any point in time, if anybody else wants to write something like Harry Potter and wants to make it as popular as it once was, it is important to go back to these books, read them, and understand where she went wrong, so that you don't do it again. That's what criticism builds. It builds.
But
it builds.
did she go wrong in her literary prowess? Yes.
Yes, of course. I was also talking about this with you because, for example, a lot of her female characters, it's very clear all of the internalized misogyny that J.K. Rowling kind of inflicts on younger readers, because this is not something I realized when I was reading it when I was 12. It's something I realized much, much later.
Okay.
For example, all the character, and this is very notable in many other authors, especially authors that target young girls, but like all of the strong female characters have to give up a sense of femininity, and she purposely compares them to other female characters that possess those characteristics in order to make them powerful. I'll explain myself. So Hermione is a wonderful character, and it is obviously a very important character, but at the same time, she builds these characters as, oh, she doesn't care about her looks, she doesn't care about romance or boys, she only cares about always being right, and studying, and that is how she presents powerfulness through, women, if they give up a sense of femininity. And that's not always bad, because at the end of the day, Hermione is a great character. It starts to become bad once she compares them to other female characters such as Cho Chang, or I forgot what Ron's girlfriend in one of the books was, but when she compares them to these characters, she makes it a point that these other girls are too girly. They like their hair, they have other female friends.
So because of that, they're weak.
Yes, and that she actually describes them like that. Cho Chang, if you read in between the lines and don't just read what, J.K. Rowling writes, you realize that she had every right to be very emotional. Her boyfriend was murdered in front of her. The person that she liked, she felt guilty about because it was the reason her boyfriend was murdered. Her parents were being fired. She was in the middle of a war, and she was still a teenager going through high school. She had every right in the world to be emotional. But it was a laughable moment in the eyes of J.K. Rowling. And she used Cho Chang as a comparison to Ginny, who was very similar to Hermione, just strong and didn't care about any of the, only hung out with men really, and did not present any of those hyper feminine, features that a lot of women who are just as powerful do have. And the same thing with Ron's girlfriend. She was ridiculized for two, whole books. But in reality, all she was someone who was in love with a guy who didn't end up liking her back. And J.K. Rowling, pinned her against Hermione as this ditzy, stupid girl, who only lived for Ron's satisfaction, when in reality she was just a girl who was in love and did not have that love reciprocated. And so if you were going to analyze literature critically, it's important to talk about those things, because as much as I love this franchise, I never want to see it rewritten, and I never want to see it rewritten that way. So if there's going to be another Harry Potter, and if another author is going to write something like this, they need to take that into consideration, because little girls cannot keep reading these exact same characters, and little queer kids don't have to be searching and searching and searching to find someone that represents them in every single piece of literature. And the same thing with characters of color. If you look at and I'm not talking about the Shakespeares and the Charles Dickens, because we know that those are historically, they would not stand today, and they should not stand today. They're just,
So Shakespeare would not stand today.
It would not. But Shakespeare is still the greatest poet to ever live. but he should never. It should never exist anymore. There shouldn't be another Shakespeare, because even Shakespeare,
But we all want another Shakespeare.
No, we don't, because famously Shakespeare besides Macbeth, maybe he almost never gave women a role unless they were love interests or were gonna get married or were underage
Or poison someone.
or yes, exactly. Or they were just mythical monsters of whatever, because that's how women were portrayed. And I understand that it's historical, the reason that they're written this way, but it should never be rewritten. It should never be rewritten, because that is not what women should have to read today. It really shouldn't. We have been reading this for centuries.
Okay, so this is extremely devastating what you're saying. You're saying that today in schools we should not teach Shakespeare.
When did I say that?
Because you said
I never said
that
that.
should never be written again,
I
and
said
that women
written.
should never have to read that again.
Well, but that's different. When you teach Shakespeare in school, you should teach it critically. You should go, look, he was an incredible poet, and this is why. But he also wrote this way, because this is how he thought of women. Because that's how you analyze literature. You analyze it through every point of view.
Through its historical context.
You should exactly. So you should 100% teach Shakespeare in schools. You should just be able to teach it honestly. And what I mean by women should not have to reread this is that because when we read Shakespeare, once again, we know why he writes women this way. Even if you don't teach it in a classroom, anybody who, reads one of his plays or one of his poems, you are well aware as to why he wrote
aren't
it.
you sacrificing the quality of the author when you're looking at through the lens of discrimination and persecution or something like that?
No, not at all. Because you can still enjoy it. I still watch these movies religiously. I still read these books like if it was the first time I'm ever reading them. I still enjoy them. If we are not capable as human beings, as a society, as students, to take something that we enjoy and understand that it isn't perfect, then we should not be able to read anything, because it's just blissful ignorance and it doesn't make any sense. And I'm not saying that this is strictly if we were to really sit down and talk about these works of art, or if we were to sit down and talk about them in a classroom, but you are still you have still every right to enjoy these things. But it's something that you should pay attention to, especially in an era where we, think about like dystopian authors as well, fantasy authors who have the tendency to write the same characters and to not give anybody any other like representation. I mean, it's not possible that almost every genre of dystopian, fantasy, the main characters are always white. The main leaders of the revolution are always right. And if we were to look at that, not only is it not real representation, it's also not very realistic. That the leaders of a class revolution are white. It can happen. It has happened. Every single, the Hunger Games and the Maze Runners and Divergence of them all, they're all white.
Should people feel ashamed of what they call white privilege?
It's not really about shame. It's about knowing that you have white privilege and understanding that you need to, if you want to actually actively be a part of change, sacrifice some of that privilege for other people. It's not about shame, because that doesn't really do anything. It's understanding that you have it and work towards, redistributing that privilege to those who deserve it and who should have it.
So how do you redistribute your white privilege?
A lot of the times it's through wealth, because white people are much more likely to, accumulate generational wealth.
Okay.
A lot of the times is with the ability to literally speak, because black voices are constantly silenced, and they are constantly, marginalized. And if there isn't a black voice in the room, and yet, conversations about these things come up, white people should either pass the microphone to someone who knows, like another person of color, or stand up for their fellow POC. So, yeah.
POC.
People of color.
people of all these abbreviations. We don't know them. See, we're trying to learn as we go along. So in to close up this amazing interview, so what would you think about, the literary program in general? What changes do you think we should have?
Maybe not changes. I would say it's you would notice that kids know about these things if you just like ask. If as a literary professor you were to sit down and ask, what is it something that you don't see as like, it just doesn't sit right with you when you read this, you would notice that a lot of people have a lot of things to say. Because we notice these kinds of things and we can still enjoy them, but it's something that you notice, especially kids from marginalized communities. If you would read something like, I don't know, like Harry Potter, and you were, to analyze it in a Socratic circle, and you would realize that maybe a lot of kids of color feel like they cannot relate to something like this, or they would be like, why is it that the one black character is called Shacklebolt? Like, it sounds kind of...
Shackle?
Yeah.
That has a...
Thank you.
Intense implication behind it.
Exactly. So it's more about like listening to what, students have to say, but also like as adults should be okay with finding criticizing the things that they like, because then they don't actually like it. I feel like if you just excuse bad behavior, you don't actually like something. You just kind of like are blissfully aware of everything. And
just accept it.
And just accept it, which doesn't do anything. It doesn't actually, it's not learning or teaching. It shouldn't be what teachers are doing. We should be okay with telling the hard truths, because kids can handle it.
At any age.
Of course.
Kids can handle it.
Of course.
Bueno, tremenda revelación con la que Shannon ha concluido acá el programa en el día de hoy. Revisar nuestros programas curriculares, sobre todo en el área de literatura, y entender que los alumnos tienen capacidad para manejar mucho más de lo que quizá nosotros hasta el día de hoy como adultos estamos dispuestos a entregarles. Shannon, thank you very much for being with us, and we're going to miss you.
Thank you.
Hasta aquí nuestro programa del día de hoy. Yo soy Fauntly Garrido y espero que todos lo hayan disfrutado, y nos vemos la semana entrante en otra entrega acá en New Horizons Radio.
New Horizons Radio.